Just before we get started with the talks, I'd like to hand over to Matt Batman, the current chair of the New South Wales chapter of PIANC, to say a few words.
Thanks, Sean. Much appreciated. PIANC, just very quickly, and I'm sure everyone's aware of it, is really just a forum to provide expert advice on infrastructure for waterborne transport, including things such as design, development and maintenance of ports, waterways and coastal areas. Obviously, we're talking about, the presenters are talking about working groups today. PIANC working group reports are a core business of PIANC, and they're a highly respected resource for governments, companies and industry associations. The presentation today provides updates by Australian experts involved in the working groups on three of the many established PIANC international working groups, and will highlight, hopefully, the important role they play within our industry. In PIANC Australia, New Zealand, it's about providing leadership opportunities to our members, and the working groups are one of these ways to provide these opportunities or to gain these opportunities. And we really encourage our members to get actively involved in the working groups. Or another way is also to, or preferably, is also to join one of the regional chapters, such as the New South Wales chapter. Additionally, we're just about to, it's quite topical, we're about to announce another working group called How to Attract Green Funding for Nature-Based Navigation Infrastructure. If members should, all members should consider if they've got any expertise in this area, and please keep a lookout for the call for members to participate. The New South Wales chapter, really quickly, was kick-started again last year, and I'm proud to say we have a very motivated, committed group who've already delivered events in 2019 and 2020, which have been well received. Just like this virtual webinar, this year has really become the year of virtual events, and planning for events in 2020 has been quite difficult. We've held a few, or we've held one already this year, which was well received. Just a quick plug for the YouTube channel, where you can see that presentation. It was undertaken in June 2020. We are planning for a virtual event in the next couple of months, in either a YP or speed networking event. We did have a really big, fantastic, it's quite topical, theme planned for the end of this year called Cruise 2020. Unfortunately, we have to delay that until 2021. And one more quick plug for the chapter is that we are looking for a deputy YP, young professional lead, and more info will be coming in October. Just to finish it off, the most important event for PIANC this year is APEC 2020. I'm sure you've all heard about it, and early bird registrations are closing on the 18th. It will be attended both in person in WA or online, and there's lots of different options for everyone to register. And finally, just one last plug for the next event from one of our local chapters in Victoria in a week's time, and this presentation targets basically how basic ship hydrodynamic principles can enhance our ability to explore and understand the Antarctic. So if you want to hear more of these details, please contact myself or go to the PIANC website or look at all our social media advertisements. Thanks so much, Sean.
Great, thanks, Matt. I should also, just before we get started, make the point that, you know, we typically, and we being COPEP and PIANC, typically look to collaborate on an event every year. It typically takes the form of a full-day annual seminar, which obviously wasn't possible this year. So I'm glad that we've found the opportunity to collaborate, and look forward to doing so between Engineers Australia and COPEP in the future.
And I'd really like to thank you guys. I forgot that part. Thanks so much for the organisation and the collaboration as well for today.
Great, thanks. So the format for today is going to be, we'll have three presenters on three different working groups. We'll run through each around 15 minutes each, and then have a short Q&A session at the end of each. So again, feel free to start posting your questions on the Q&A section on the right, and I will moderate those questions as we go at the end of each talk. So our first presenter is Tanja Mackenzie, Principal Environmental Scientist at Carbno. Tanja works in environmental impact assessment and planning, environmental monitoring and compliance, and natural resource management across a range of multidisciplinary projects. One of her key areas of interest is climate change adaptation, and she has undertaken a number of investigations into climate change risks for infrastructure projects. So Tanja is going to be presenting today on the Working Group Report number 178, which is the Climate Change Adaptation Planning for Ports and Inland Waterways. Over to you, Tanja.
Fantastic. Okay, so as Sean introduced me, I'm talking about Technical Working Group 178 that prepared some climate change adaptation guidelines for ports and navigational infrastructure. So I think it was around 2015 that EnviCom invited expressions of interest to join this group, and the terms of reference for the working group were to provide background information on adaptation concepts and processes, information on adaptation options, to use the guideline to advocate for preparedness and to identify and provide advice on challenges. The intent of the guideline was to have a framework for decision making, and we wanted to have a lot of case studies to support all of the above. And it was quite a group of about maybe 30 people with membership from various sectors and countries around the world. And there were 5 meetings of the working group held in Europe, in London, Brussels and Spain. And otherwise we worked remotely and communicated with each other during that process. So there were representatives from, say, government agencies, consultants, universities, and also international associations such as the International Association of Dredging Companies. I'd also like to acknowledge Anna Nelson from Oricon, who is up in Brisbane, who was a very active contributing member of the working group, and also people who might be attending today who provided case studies. So just to give you an overview of the guidelines, it's basically broken down on a 4-stage process. So there's a chapter for each of these stages. Stage 1 is about context and objectives. Stage 2 about climate information. Stage 3 involves a detailed vulnerability and risk assessments. And stage 4 is where you're looking at your adaptation options. And of course, as you can see by the arrows there, it should in theory be an iterative process. So for example, you might work through this whole process, but then have some new information that becomes available that might necessitate an update to your adaptation strategy. And you'll also notice stakeholder engagement is at the centre of this process and should inform all stages and carry through to the implementation phase. And we've got 15 case studies in the guideline that, as well as worked examples and templates for completing some tasks. So moving through to stage 1, basically it's a planning phase where you think about what your adaptation strategy is trying to achieve, who needs to be involved and what it might focus on. So you start by collating an inventory of your assets, operations and systems for your port, and then assess how critical they are and do a very quick first pass vulnerability assessment of what climate hazards might each of these elements be vulnerable to. And those initial tasks, I'll show you an example on the next stage, but they kind of might assist you in starting to think about your management objectives. And when you're developing your management objectives in stage 1, there are constraints and opportunities you might want to consider, such as what are your available resources or your budget for developing the adaptation strategy and also for implementing it? Are there any jurisdictional boundaries? Are there secondary outcomes that are important? And also, what planning horizon are you looking at focusing on? And you need to start identifying, based on these first steps, what data do you need to work through the process? So just as an example of management objectives, I've got a case study from the guideline for Avatiu Port in Rarotonga in the Cook Islands, which was a case study provided based on a project by WRL. And just as an example, their guidelines were, objectives were to understand the risks posed by changes to sea level and wave behaviour on coastal infrastructure and communities in the Avarua area, particularly during extreme events. So you can see they're starting to really define the scope of their adaptation strategy there. identify needs and develop options for responses to the risks. And the third objective, which is a great example of a secondary outcome, is to build local capacity to understand the science and manage the risk assessment and planning processes. So here's an example of that inventory which you can start building up. So you can see on the left here you've got all your different assets and operations for your port, which might be structural elements like quay walls or slipways, or might be operations such as pilotage or dredging. The first purple column here looks at criticality. So here you're interested in things such as business continuity. If your quay wall is damaged, how does it affect continuity? Are there, for example, strategic implications of that asset being down, for example, for the regional economy? Just a very quick first pass assessment of different climate change hazards here in the second purple column for each of those elements, just based on professional judgment or past experience. You can also start to collate some key facts such as what's the residual life of your asset and what condition is it in. And you can keep building on this kind of inventory as you work through the stages. So in stage 2, you then need to understand what data on those climate hazards is available and where it can be sourced from and what its limitations are. So you need to understand what climate parameters and processes are important. So that is informed by that previous step. You need to then, for those climate parameters, collate your baseline information to understand existing trends, and not just the day-to-day stuff, but also your extreme events. And they're important because they may necessitate contingency planning or a disaster response as part of your adaptation strategy. You also want to be thinking about for your planning horizons you picked in the first stage, what are the climate change projections available? Are they downscaled, for example, for your locality? And you need to basically start analysing that climate data on the climate change hazards for each of your planning horizons. In stage 3, you start to do more detailed assessments of vulnerability. As shown in the flowchart in the bottom right, for the vulnerability assessment, the aim is to assess in more detail how your vulnerability might change over time. So you need to confirm which climate hazards are important for that affect each asset or operation. Does the susceptibility of that asset change over time? So, for example, does it have some adaptive capacity or built-in redundancy? Is there a point at which a threshold is exceeded? So that might be, it might have a certain design criteria, and at some point in time in the future, that threshold is exceeded. And these thresholds are quite important risk indicators to understand. And then you move into the detailed risk assessment, and you might want to discuss with your stakeholders what level of risk assessment to do. And I think one of the important things is to define an acceptable level of risk to your organisation. So, for example, you might be able to tolerate a 20% increase of maintenance costs arising from damage to assets from weather, or you might be able to accommodate a certain amount of downtime, but anything beyond that is considered unacceptable. And this helps you kind of start to frame your consequence criteria for your risk assessment. Now, for this vulnerability and risk assessments, really it can be as simple or as complex as you like. You can use qualitative information like historical observations, or you can do quite sophisticated numerical analyses as well. It's important to understand the limitations and uncertainty associated with that data. So then you get into stage 4. You've identified your key risks that you want to address, and you start to look at adaptation options. So within the guidelines, there's a toolbox of adaptation options, and these, so this is an example here of generic adaptation options, and they're all framed around physical measures, social measures, and institutional measures. And they were identified based on extensive international engagement. They ran workshops in several countries and also had some international associations, such as the International Maritime Pilots Association, who provided input. And they've got one of these toolboxes, a table, for each of these key climate hazards. So there's one for flooding, there's one for overtopping, such as from sea level rise or storm surge. There's a toolbox of adaptation measures for low flow and drought conditions, and so on. And what the guideline advocates is that you start with this long list and do an initial screening process to develop a shorter list, which you might start to filter them out based on the cost of implementation, technical feasibility, how well the option reduces your risk, whether there's co-benefits of implementing the option. It might make it more attractive, or if it's a low or no risk option. And then you basically move to the next stage, which is once you've got your short list of adaptation options, you can consider how to evaluate them, preferably in a more quantitative way. So the guideline talks about all the different options that you have and what the pros and cons of all of these are. And don't forget, you may want to explicitly consider the implications of not taking action to strengthen resilience and adapt, because that will effectively form your baseline against which you're comparing any options or suites of options. And really, there's a few issues to consider, such as, do you even have the data available to do a quantitative assessment, and how easy it is to quantify or monetize different data, different information that you're looking at. So then you basically use the outcomes of these evaluations to prepare your adaptation strategy and agree on your priorities for implementation, undertake more consultation with your stakeholders, and then you get into the implementation stage. So there might be things you can do there which the guideline recommends you consider, such as monitoring programs and other research and technical studies. And that takes me to the end of my presentation. Thanks, Sean.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Tanja. If there are any questions for Tanja, please start posting in the Q&A box, and I can relay them on. Maybe to start, Tanja, are there specific references, data sets or guidelines that the working group report will recommend, or is that open to the user?
So really it's open to the discretion of the user. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the availability of data, in particular downscale data, is variable depending on where you are. I think we're quite lucky in Australia, but that's not the case everywhere in the world. And that also applies to information on existing climate, which may not be available. So really the guideline talks about what to consider and what types of data sets are out there and points you to some of those.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so maybe in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next presentation from Dr. Wim van der Molen, who is the Floating Systems Lead at BAIRD Australia. Wim has experience working in Europe, South Africa, North America, and is currently, as I said, the Floating Systems Lead at BAIRD Australia. He's responsible for the setup and quality control of port operability and ship navigation projects across the global company at BAIRD. He's been the technical lead in the development of several port operational systems, such as forecasting systems for underkeel clearance in shipping channels and for prediction of moored ship motions and mooring line courses in coastal terminals. Wim is on the committee for the working group report number 212, which is the criteria for acceptable movement of ships at berth, an update to MarCom WG24. So I'll hand over to Wim now. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, John, for that. That's right. So we have last year started with a new working group on the criteria for acceptable movements of ships at berth. So that looks at the criteria of the movements. So figuring out how much they can move which then can be an input in design of new terminals around the world. And it's showcased here as an update to a previous working group, which occurred in the 90s. And there has generally been a feeling that those criteria are now outdated. Either we're a little too simplistic, or just due to involvement in the shipping industry and so forth. So it made a lot of sense to relook at that, and that now finally a new working group is starting with that. So we're all enthusiastic to gather information and move along towards finishing our report. I'll have to say that at the moment we are still in the phase of gathering information, which should come to an end, let's say early next year. So please, if anyone has any suggestions or things that they know good contacts for us to contact in regards to this working group, then please point that out in the questions afterwards. So the working group was established early last year. We have 18 members from all around the world. So it's a reasonably large working group. So in that way, trying to bring together as much expertise from different backgrounds and different parts of the world to join this committee. And also it's a fairly comprehensive topic with many different ships and terminals involved. So it's good that we have a good number of members available to gather information and to come to agreements. So far, we've had 2 face-to-face meetings, both last year. There was supposed to be one early this year, which got cancelled due to the COVID restrictions. And at the moment, we're mostly focusing on coming together in subgroups to gather information, to plan all that process. And then next year, there will be more opportunities to come together with the whole group and come to conclusions. Hopefully, some of the restrictions are released by then, or otherwise we'll continue on this more online format. So we anticipate to finish everything by early 2020. So the objective of our working group is to gather existing technical information on criteria for safe and efficient limits for movement of moored ships, including the effects of such movements on operations as cargo handling and so forth, and to develop practical criteria for guidelines for port authorities and designers. So I've underlined a few items here. So we're focused on gathering existing information. So that means we reach out to terminal operators, port authorities, just in general knowledgeable people in this field. Not so much doing our own research, which I think is not really in the mandate of such a working group. And there are criteria for safe and efficient limits, which are 2 different items. So either safe, so if there is a chance that mooring equipment will break or there's damage to the ship, then that's a safety concern. And efficiency has more to do with how fast can you load or how fast can you disembark passengers from a ship, which we will also look at. And in the end, we'll have to bring that all together and develop practical criteria which they can then use for design of new terminals. So that means that it has to be reasonably simple to use, as opposed to developing difficult spreadsheets or whatnot. And the results of this working group will replace working group 24, criteria for movement of moored ships from the 90s. And for the container ships, that has already been replaced in 2012 with a new report looking at container vessels. Back then it was the idea that the criteria were too lenient for container vessels, and so they looked at that. We will also update it, although there's probably not as much of an update needed compared to other types of terminals. So these are the working group members. We won't go over all of them, but highlight maybe a few. So the chairman of our committee is Majid Javari from the US and working in Houston, and has worked on several working groups before. So it was a good chairman for us to lead this working group. So further, the working group is fairly heavy from Europe, 4 members from the Netherlands, 3 from the UK, and 3 from Spain. But there are several members from all around the world as well, including two from Australia, myself, and Max Foster from Trelleborg in Melbourne. 1 member from New Zealand, Luther Terblanche. So he was selected from South Africa, but recently moved to New Zealand. And overall, we have a good mixed background. Several people working in consultancy firms, but also for port authorities, like Peter Nordbeck from the Port of Rotterdam. Martijn Breuer has recently been added to the working group and is a good addition. So he's from Shore Tension in Holland, who are developing a new system to augment the moorings of a ship. And he has dealt with several ports around the world where they needed to reduce ship motions. A good addition there. Bit of background here on the working group 24 that worked in the 90s. But if you look at their results that they eventually implemented in the guidelines, were mostly based on a few Norwegian studies from the 1980s. So those are now more than 30 years old, and were mostly based on Panamax vessels, except for the tankers. So especially in the bulk carriers and the container ships, there has been a tremendous amount of change in the type of vessels and the size of the vessels, which we have to now implement in our new guidelines. Also, it was felt that some of the guidelines were a little simplistic. All the criteria just refer to maximum motions and only at the center of gravity. So, for instance, if you are loading in a bulk carrier all the way in the front of near the bow, then those movements there will be different than near midship, which for smaller vessels doesn't make as much of a difference. But now with bigger vessels, that makes a change too. So we'll have to incorporate that. And so there's a change in size of vessels, but also developments in loading equipment over those 30 years. So there has already been an update from that 90s report with respect to container ships. So these the new working group looked at loading of container ships, mostly focusing on the post-Panamax container vessels, and loaded with modern gantry cranes. So you see in the photo here a spreader of one of those gantry cranes, in this case with 2 containers connected to it. Very often they will pick up one and go to the vessel, and then in the top there, here you can see how the loading looks like. So the ship has cell guides. Those are these things here on the side, and the container has to fit between those cell guides. Now, after the report from the 90s, it was felt that those criteria were too lenient, and that the criterion basically should be that the movement of the vessels should be such that the container never goes outside this area where the cell guides are, to avoid damage. In the end, after gathering all the information and also doing several numerical runs where they place containers in a virtual cell guide, they came to the conclusion that the vessel can move outside of the cell guides for some amount of time, and the crane operator will just wait until the ship moves back and then places it inside. But obviously, at some point, either he has to wait too long and the efficiency goes down, or the ship moves too much, that damage can occur. And here's an example of a graph of significant surge motion amplitude of the vessel here on the horizontal axis, and the efficiency of the loading on the vertical axis. And based on that, the criterion was established as between 0.2 and 0.4 meters. So the benefits for Australia, see, there are many ports exposed to waves. There are many ports exposed to waves here in Australia. And there is also an increase in sizes of container ships. So what happens at the moment is the new build largest container ships in the world, they mostly are on the China to Europe trade route. And some of the vessels that were there previously are now phased to different routes, such as from China to Australia. So there's a large increase there. Also an increase in the size of ships for dry bulk terminals, like the iron ore export from the Northwest Shelf. And there have been many recent LNG export developments, primarily from Western Australia. So we could definitely benefit from having a good new set of established rules that they can apply during their operations and any new developments that will come up here in Australia. So we have divided our working group into subgroups, which is a good way of organizing things with such a fairly large group of members. I'll go over them. So we have oil and gas. So there perhaps less change in the size of vessels in oil and gas industry, but there has been a lot of advancement in safety and loading equipment. So there's a need for change there. And dry bulk and general cargo, which we grouped together. The container vessels that I already pointed out in relation to the previous working group. Ro-ro vessels and cruise ships, which also have increased in size, and the whole cruise industry was not so much there 30 years ago. So there were criteria for ferries, but not so much for cruise vessels. And in these very large vessels, they will respond a little differently. And then we have a last group of smaller vessels that we group together. So that could be tugboats, supply vessels, fishing boats, and also recreational vessels. So we've now identified that probably recreational vessels like yachts and small motorboats are not so much in our scope and should be diverted to a different part of PIANC, as we are less knowledgeable about that. Also like to point out for the oil and gas, we are closely working together with OCIMF, such that our report will coincide with their proceedings as well. So we formulated a list of questions that we discuss with terminal operators, port authorities, and so forth. The idea has been that we don't want to go too specific on sending them a questionnaire and just hoping for an answer, which very often doesn't return, but just have an open conversation with them about what triggers their ship movements, like waves, winds, but now also with expanding ports, passing ship issues, tending mooring lines. What kind of operations are affected, the loading and offloading mainly for cargo ships, and the passenger and crew embarkation, which is mostly important for the passenger vessels, and what kind of risks are involved. So how strict do we need to be in our criteria? And if they have any measurements or any ideas available, they can come up with that. But any information just on these type of issues can already be beneficial to us. So after the discussions that we have had so far, so we have already got some developments at least. So the criteria, as we will propose them, will probably be at the position of loading or at the position of where the crew or passengers disembark or embark the vessel, instead of at the center of gravity, especially for the larger vessels. That makes much more sense. And there could be, at least for some types of vessels, a distinction between efficiency and risk criteria, similar to SLS and ULS criteria. And so the efficiency is more for how fast can you load, and the risk criteria is at what point do we see damage. And the efficiency criteria should probably be related to significant motions instead of the maximum motions from the previous working group, in a similar way as what was established for the container ships, because the efficiency more deals with what continuously goes on instead of one fluke movement per hour, let's say. So there's a distinction also between highly competitive and remote terminals. For some parts we may not be able to address that just because there's not enough data available. But wherever we can, then we try to do that. Like container terminals in Europe are highly competitive and need to operate at almost 100% efficiency all the time. Whereas a smaller terminal in Africa, and even many of the terminals here in Australia are much farther apart from each other, so have fewer of these competition constraints. And the risk criteria should probably be related to maximum oceans, because a risk of damage can occur at any point, and such a maximum movement should just not occur. So the planning now is we will continue with our online subgroup meetings for another, let's say, half a year. Continue gathering information from port authorities and terminal operators. We've got a few terminal operators and port authorities already in our working group, which is a great benefit. And other than that, we'll reach out to our contacts. Then we'll write the relevant sections in the report early next year, bring all of that together, and start a process of review where we put that forward to the entire working group and see how we can best bring everything together. The idea is then to finalize our report in about 1.5 years' time from now. So that's where we're at the moment. Like I said in the beginning, we're still very open to any kinds of inputs, questions, information, or contacts that you know. So please bring that forward if you can. Over to you, Sean.
Great. Thanks a lot, Wim. We might just skip along to the next presentation now, but if there are questions for Wim, please feel free to post them on the Q&A section. We'll get a download of that after the webinar and I can pass them on to Wim who can respond. So thanks, Wim. So our next presenter is Ron Cox, Honorary Associate Professor at the Water Research Laboratory of UNSW. Ron has over 45 years experience across many areas of water, environmental and coastal engineering, including teaching at university and training a large number of the current practicing engineers and managers, and also working and undertaking research with industry and government within Australia and also overseas. Ron's a long-standing member of PIANC Australia, member of the PIANC International Commission's PTGCC, you might have to tell me what that is, Ron, EnviCom and COCOM, and is also a previous chair of Engineers Australia, the National Committee of Coastal and Ocean Engineering. And over the last 10 years, he's provided advice on climate adaptation, flood and coastal policy to federal, state and local government in Australia. So Ron's going to give us a rundown of the PIANC Working Group Report number 188, Carbon Management for Port and Navigation Infrastructure.
Okay, Sean, can you hear me and can you see the presentation?
Sure can, all looking good and sounding good.
Okay, fine, okay. Welcome, good evening to you all. I'm giving this presentation on behalf of Doug Doherty, who is the chair of the working group. Doug works for Rambol, and I'll do a little bit more, and he's prepared these slides, so I'm really just presenting his material with a little bit of anecdotes about Australian content. Okay, like most of the working groups, they're conscientious people. They meet probably about 4 or 5 times. This group met at different major ports, infrastructure centerpieces around the world. You'll see later by the case studies that they were again dominated by Europe and America. The working group, these are the direct members, the chair, and these working groups, generally we provide a mentor from the Commission. This is from PTGCC, Permanent Task Group on Climate Change. The mentor was Philip van der Putte from Belgium, and the chair was Doug Doherty. And you'll see if you just go through the membership that there's people there from US, France, Japan, different places. There was also a similar group, what we call corresponding members, of which I was one, that would help particularly in the editing and the final production of the document. Okay, the background to this, why did it all start? Why did we need a working group on carbon? It started back in COP21 with the Paris Agreement. In the Paris Agreement in COP21, all the nations of the world committed to reducing and keeping global temperature rise below 2 degrees C with a target of 1.5 degrees. And within that, it was quite clear that navigation and shipping operations, as part of other transport operations, had an important role to play. For shipping, it was agreed that the International Maritime Organization, IMO, would look after shipping greenhouse gas emissions and reducing them. And IMO came out with 13 short-term, 5 mid-term and 2 long-term measures. And the vision was to reduce greenhouse gases in the shipping industry to be carbon-free by 2100. Now, that was the original intention. We then come along to the PIANC formed the Navigating Climate Change Initiative, which is an initiative between PIANC and a range of key other industry groups in the navigation sector, looking at navigating and coming up with ways of reducing our impact on greenhouse gas emissions. As part of that, then followed on with PTGCC. Seem to have jammed. Okay, sorry about that. Everyone see that now?
Yep, that looks good.
Okay, we're now down to looking at why manage carbon in the navigation sector. There was 5 main reasons, and they're all there for you: to comply with the emerging greenhouse gas regulatory requirements, general stakeholder, if you like, it's the license to operate, be a good corporate citizen. Then roles 3 and 4 are both essentially the roles that PIANC sets for itself in terms of setting the course for the future, both in shipping and in port and navigation infrastructure. And the 5th one was to take advantage of the unique opportunities to reduce and offset emissions, working with nature and engineering with nature from the US and other sequestration of carbon in blue carbon offsets and seagrass options. So the charge, as determined by the terms of reference, were here. What it do says, first of all, take a look at what's already out there in terms of carbon footprinting that would be relevant. Consider the life cycle analysis and make sure that it's fully included in the assessment of carbon. And then investigate opportunities, if you like, the opportunities in terms of operational practices, working with nature, better land use management around our ports and navigation infrastructure, seagrass and blue carbon projects, and then related environmental management. The guidance document is in 4 parts. It's not meant to be prescriptive. It's actually meant to provide relevant considerations and thoughts to help you guide you through. It's not prescriptive, it's a guide document. And as an indication under the carbon management framework, it shows you how to set goals and targets, how to do life cycle analysis, and look at carbon in contracting and the reporting and monitoring. You go across to the, if we go across to the carbon reduction opportunities, that chapter looks at best practices in terms of materials and construction, operations, and managing carbon sinks. The others I'll leave alone for the moment in terms of time. There's good information on all the different stakeholders that may be involved in any plan that you may develop or in reducing greenhouse gases, from direct roles, the various stakeholders, right down to indirect roles in key global influences. And in this particular table, you actually see that up in the top left corner with the darker colouring, these are the most obvious stakeholders and players that will play a role. Down in the bottom right, you get to the various groups who are less obvious and less important. Less obvious as having a role, but not less important. So although they're coloured that way, you should not think that because they're an environmental group down as an indirect role, they're not as important as the direct tenants and operators. They can be, and it depends on each particular project you're looking at. This is not a unique design. It's a little bit different. It's been modified for a particular port and navigation sector. It's a fairly typical adaptation and carbon life cycle analysis methodology, starting with design and the importance of design in terms of setting the scene and at least getting you on the right path, through to material processing in terms of making sure you properly account for embedded carbon, through to construction, associated restoration, adaptation, mitigation. These are the opportunities for you with working with nature to actually get carbon offsets or carbon benefits by in fact absorbing carbon or methane, carbon dioxide and methane. Operation and maintenance, the shipping operations, the cranes, general operational activities of the port. And then again, end of life, where you actually, with a full life cycle analysis, you have to dispose of all the materials and recycle back to, it's the old cradle at the design stage through to the grave. You have to close the loop. So it's quite important that the design recognises that having gone through all this, at the end, you have to dispose of what you've got left. It's a little bit like the leftover offshore oil platforms that are abounding around the world. They weren't necessarily considered to be important to get rid of at the end, and the cost is often exorbitant. We need to avoid that. Timeframes are important. The importance of design. Even though at the start of design, here's your accuracy of carbon accounting over time. At the start in the design process, you're not really sure of all the processes you're going to go through in the project right through to end of life. So your accuracy of predicting the total carbon footprint is difficult, but your ability to influence the life cycle full carbon content is highest. So somewhere around that design and authorisation, there's a sweet spot where you need to actually take advantage of that ability to influence the total cost, even though you may not be able to analyse and cost it correctly. Scope and boundaries are important. Scope 1 emissions, these are fairly obvious. These are the entity-owned fleet vehicles, infrastructure, the ships, the breakwaters, the port itself. This is the direct infrastructure costs and carbon. So you can actually look at that. You can draw a boundary around it. It's generally the local area around your port or your infrastructure. We then go to the infrastructure indirect. Can we actually have a higher carbon input? Because it could actually be electricity and entity-owned infrastructure to operate water and electricity that service your port from further away. Then you've got scope 3, all your infrastructure users, your tenants, your ships, trucks, cargo handling equipment. So you've got all these different inputs of carbon, methane, and nitrous oxide, all your greenhouse gases coming from various sources that you need to account for. And the report goes through how you can, gives you little checklists for them all and how you can account for them all and put values on them. So the greenhouse gas quantification, it provides, if you like, calculation methodologies, and generally it adopts the IAPH or the BLEC frameworks for calculating emissions methodologies. However, there are frequently other references given to other more detailed work for, if you like, blue carbon type offsets, how you can take account of blue carbon or wetlands and seagrasses in terms of redevelopment of a port, putting in sinks to actually get you benefits and offsets against the carbon you may be still having included in the sources of the project. There's listing of all the different sources, as well as the possible sinks and methodologies and references to those. Opportunities. This is the fun chapter. Things you can do to make it better. And some of them are extremely simple. So there's signposting, how you can do better dredging, how with beneficial use of the dredge material, you can actually create a benefit. There's things you can do in the logistics chain, particularly in terms of moving from fossil fuels to electricity driven, and where the electricity is renewably generated. materials, different types of materials which have a lower carbon footprint, and operations and maintenance. And then again, obviously, the co-benefits that come from particular ideas like working with nature. Financial carbon reductions, there are financial summaries. This is a useful summary. It shows you the cost per tonne of carbon against the reduction in million tonnes per year of different steps or opportunities. So if you like, if you look at voyage execution, so in fact, if you are able to better manage your shipping and your voyage processes, you can actually get a benefit. You can actually save yourself money, but the carbon offset is minimal. Whereas you go across here, you're starting to get into cold ironing here, where you actually provide, if you like, electricity at the berth. You actually see it's quite expensive, up to about $120, $140 per tonne of carbon, but it actually has a major benefit in millions of tonnes per year over in the far right-hand side. So if you like, a whole range of steps you can take with their likely benefit and their likely cost. And that's a summary table or summary figure. There's plenty of other information. Case studies, extremely valuable. We all love case studies, so you can have a look at what other people have done and learn from them. In setting up the case studies, the group was very careful that for each of the case studies submitted by the different people around the world, they wanted the content to be set up under 6 headings. So drivers, what are the drivers? Why are you doing this? What is the scope for carbon management? What actions are included? What are the outcomes achieved? What are the lessons learned? And what are the critical success factors? So there's 5 particular case studies. One was DP World, where the group gathered. Port of San Diego, which is, I'm going to talk about. That's the only one I have time to chat with. And this one was from the objectives of the Port of San Diego. And again, this was done back in 2013. Doug Doherty was the lead consultant in working up this particular climate action plan. They decided to develop a carbon reduction plan. It covers not just their emissions, but also their tenants' emissions within the geographic scope defined by the port. It was a voluntary program. It is designed to support various port programs and policies. So if you like, the driver was that the Port of San Diego wanted to become a better corporate citizen and believed that it would be a strategic good position to be in, be ahead of the game rather than be dragged into it later by regulators. Okay, now later on the state regulations were brought in, but not at the time that they started on their plan. Okay. So if you like, what was the goals? And I think this comes back to something that Tanja alluded to earlier in Working Group 178 that they identified right up front in stage 1. Similarly here, you need to define a goal, what your target is. So if you like, the whole goal for this particular climate action plan and greenhouse gas mitigation was to take the 2006 greenhouse gas emissions, and they were broken up into, you like, electricity and natural gas, transport, off-road and on-road, and then the minor bits of water and other things. But quite clearly you can see it's a typical fairly high throughput port. Electricity and natural gas are the highest carbon input, with transportation next. With 2020, their target was to reduce the 2006 greenhouse gas emissions by 10% by 2020. That's not that adventuresome. That was all they were aiming to do, but it was to avoid the business as usual 2020 growth of 20%. So essentially they were, and this was done in 2013, they were trying halfway between the 2006 and 2020. They wanted to get below what they were 2006 and to avoid climbing well up into the 1 million tonnes of carbon per year. Nice little, I'll leave you with this from Doug. It's a nice little thing to carry with you. Good thought. A goal without a plan is just a wish. And that shows in all the work that Doug's done, and I've got to thank him for letting me use the presentation and thank him for the chairmanship of this particular working group that actually did an excellent job and worked very well together. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ron, for that. That's great. If there's any questions for Ron, please post them in the Q&A box. Ron, maybe locally in Australia, what is the prevalence of these type of carbon accounting studies and climate action plans across ports in Australia?
I'm not aware. I think some of the big port operators are actually doing it, and there's quite a few of the ports are actually members of the Green Ports Initiative, which also is another group that's actually developed its own greenhouse accounting. So I think the working group report 188 is a guide. It's almost like for a port that hasn't started it seriously. This is it's like a checklist of things you need to think about. And then it actually gives you, some people are very advanced at doing auditing and carbon accounting and having plans to develop. But at the moment, there's no, as far as I know, and maybe there's plenty of good people in the audience, maybe some of them can throw a chat in to say whether their port or anyone that they know is actually doing it. And I don't believe there's any regulations in place in Australia that require it.
Yeah. And is there any expectation that those regulations or statutory requirements will come in the near future?
I think like most private operators, we all would most of the ports would believe in self-regulation and trying to tell government that we're ahead of it. You don't need to make us do it. We're actually doing it already.
Sure.
And I think that's probably the case.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, thanks again, Ron, for your time in the presentation. All very interesting. Look, again, if there are any questions for any of our presenters this evening, please feel free to either post them now or flick through an email to the EA contact. Post them in the survey that's likely to pop up on your WebEx when you log out of tonight's session. But otherwise, I'd really like to thank both PIANC Australia, the New South Wales chapter of PIANC, and the presenters tonight for their time. It's been an interesting introduction to some of those working group efforts, and we look forward to both seeing the final outcomes and using them in the near future. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great evening.